This is Understanding Autism Spectrum Disorder in the secondary school setting. This video is focused on definitions, limitations, and statistics. So what you're watching now is the definitions, statistics, and limitations video, and then 2, 3, and 4 will be the 3 core impairments of ASD, as they're often referred to, which is firstly social, language and communication, and then repeated or restricted interests or behaviours. 5 will be sensory challenges. 6 is all about recognition, classification, and alternative spaces. 7 is about the pragmatics and the challenges at a secondary school setting for students with ASD. And 8 will focus on the typical profile of an ASD student in a high school setting. Then the last video will be suggestions in regard to teaching practice and a conclusion overall of what you've learned. So the first thing you need to know is a couple of definitions. And you might just think this is kind of an irrelevant list of definitions, but it's quite important because these are actually diagnostic criteria from the DSM 3 through 5, which basically means that someone, perhaps a parent or the child themselves, could have been diagnosed with one of these categories, and therefore they're important to the person who's been diagnosed or labelled in that way. So firstly, autism comes from 1908, and it basically was arranged along a range from low ability to high ability. And it was basically focused on students which were referred to as little professors, which basically means they were advanced in certain areas of their knowledge at a younger age, but less socially able than their peers. And an older and much frowned upon phrase is idiot savant from 1887, which is your typical sort of Rain Man film type character. So they are an idiot in many respects, but a savant in one particular area or field. Next is high functioning autism, often shorthanded to HFA. And this is from around the 1990s. And there's been a number of studies that have shown people who got this diagnosis tended to perform better in school than those given a diagnosis of autism. And that's why often this might be important to some people if they had that label themselves. Nowadays it's probably used a little bit less and it's considered a bit un-PC. The next is Pdd-Nos, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which is basically just a catch-all criteria in the DSM for any other similar developmental disorder that wasn't correctly or precisely diagnosed at that time. So people might still be carrying around this diagnosis and this label. Then we have Asperger's, often shortened to ASD, which is just another form or phrase for high-functioning autism, circa about 2013. Less used today, of course. But it refers to someone lacking social skills, but what we call high functioning in regards to usually their schoolwork, and it's usually based around educational settings in that regard. And the current and most correct term we're using at the moment is autism spectrum disorder, which is circa 2013. So importantly, the key word here is spectrum. So it's a spectrum of disorders with common traits among them. Rather than the earlier low to high type ranking, it's best to think of a spectrum sort of as a circle or a rainbow that continues in a full circle with different levels of ability across different tasks represented by the individuals. So as I've said, those are different diagnoses and different labels that people have used for autism spectrum disorder. It really pays to be aware of them so that you can get a bit of an association with diagnoses that students or their parents or perhaps even their grandparents may have. And the last 2 phrases you'll need to be aware of. Firstly, neurotypical is just the word to refer to someone who has developed normally, your average student, shall we say. And a lot of the research and a lot of the things we'll be explaining here will be contrasted, sadly, constantly against neurotypical students, simply because we know a great deal about the development of neurotypical humans and students, and therefore ASD is contrasted against that, relying on what we know about a neurotypical child to get a better understanding of an ASD child. Lastly, comorbidity just means co-occurring conditions. So typically an ASD student will also have a comorbid condition. They're much more likely to have something else such as ADHD, OCD, and other types of diagnoses that we'll go through later on. So just quickly, why does this matter? Statistics suggest that ASD is on the rise. There's a number of reasons for that. There's also a small percentage of that which we're not really sure about at this point. We're not really sure why it's occurring. Obviously a large portion of it is due to diagnosis increasing, and a growing awareness of it within the community, but then there's other factors that we're not entirely sure of yet. So just have a quick scan over the statistics. I won't go into them in great detail for a reason I'll explain just in a moment, but you can see that it's quite surprisingly a high proportion of the population, and especially true of the student population, and especially true of the secondary school setting that we teach in. Importantly, there's a 5-to-1 male to female ratio in regards to ASD, so that there is a much higher percentage of males with ASD than there are females. Whether this is a mistake or an error in at the diagnosis point, we're not entirely sure, but there is significantly more male ASD people than females. So the reason I didn't go over this in great detail is simply because as McDermott, Williams, Riley, Glasson and Ray said in 2007, "In the current time, the prevalence of ASD in Australia is not certain from existing data." So basically the data being collected, especially from the census, is not particularly good, and they rely a lot on reporting from the disability sector, which doesn't fully capture the data. So the statistics earlier, you'll see there are a lot of variation within them, and that's simply because the data set is not as complete or as accurate as we would like. What we do know, however, is that Australia is 7th in the world in regards to ASD within the population, and also that ASD has increased noticeably according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So as you can see from reading here, in 6 years, the proportion has doubled. So whether that will continue apace or whether it will slow down, we're not entirely sure, but it is important to know about autism spectrum disorder as a result of these type of statistics. So as you can see from the statistic down the bottom, in 6 years the occurrence or the prevalence has doubled for autism spectrum disorder in Australia, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and we're not exactly sure why or whether this will keep going apace or whether it will slow down or stop altogether, but it's important that we know what autism spectrum disorder is, as there will be an increase in autism spectrum disorder students in our secondary schools where we teach. So before we get stuck into understanding what autism spectrum disorder is, it's important to know, as we just learnt, the limitations in regards to statistics, but also the limitations in regard to research completed. So if you look at the graph in the top right, you can see that there has been very few studies on ASD, but that they are increasing rapidly. Most notably, I think during the 60s there was quite a small number of studies done, which is, as we know from history, when a lot of unethical but very fruitful psychological studies took place, and that would have given us a wealth of information about ASD if there were more studies completed during that period. Luckily and importantly, we've learned about research ethics since then, but that does limit the types of studies that can be done in regards to autism spectrum disorder. So there are 4 kinds of studies that can be done in regards to ASD. The first is mice, which, as you can imagine, is not directly relatable, especially in a disorder as complex and as social as ASD. The second type of study available are through functional MRI, so we could do brain imaging on ASD people. Problem is putting anyone, frankly, in a large white tube and getting them to sit there and think about certain things is quite a challenging experience for most, but most ASD people also have heightened sensory issues, and so therefore fMRI is really not especially ethically viable as a study option. Thirdly is autopsy. Obviously, that's in itself, there's a lot of issues with sourcing the bodies for an autopsy, and in itself, what you draw from an autopsy is really not that useful either. And lastly, most importantly, the option for research is teacher-based study or practitioner-led research. So this is basically us performing studies, formalizing what we do into something a little bit more rigorous so that we can then suggest different educational interventions for ASD students. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview of the definitions of the different phrases used to describe ASD, some statistics on why it's relevant and important to us as educators, and some explanations of the limitations of research being carried out and why therefore we rely on a neurotypical model of development and compare ASD to that. So if you click in the description of this video, there'll be some questions to sort of jog your memory on what you just heard, and then once you've done that, move on to the next video in the series.